Can you hear me through the mic? No. Interesting. It's on. How about now? Every week, ear position changes, so I don't know if that's meaningful. I know Charles is coming, so I'm going to give him a couple minutes. Yes. Yeah, I saw Bob, but... Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Everybody can hear me okay? No? Okay. Most of you know that I used to be a Carmelite priest, so I have a special affection for Teresa and John, who were certainly part of my formation during that time and have continued to be a source of spiritual nourishment. So I couldn't, of course, do something on the mystics without including them, but they're probably, at least within the Catholic Church, recognized as some of the preeminent mystics of church history. I think they also have in their lives and in their teaching something that is very relevant for us today at this time in our country, which was not something I was thinking about as I originally put this together, but became more clear as I refined it. So some quick biographical sketches. As you can see, Teresa is older than John, but they were in fact contemporaries. And I'll go through the history in a little more detail in a minute, but John entered the Carmelite order after Teresa had long been in it, and then joined her in kind of the reform of the Carmelite order that she started. And he, in fact, was her spiritual director for a number of years. So there's a lot of similarity in their spirituality, perhaps a slightly more, you might expect, feminine approach on Teresa's part, a slightly more masculine approach. John is very organized, very kind of, his whole kind of spiritual development, you can think about it in outline form. Teresa's a little looser, but they both had influence on one another. So Teresa, who came from a fairly well-to-do middle-class family, entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila in 1534. But she quickly grew disillusioned by the spiritual laxity that was going on in that convent. The nuns who came from wealthier families were eating different food than the nuns that came from poorer families. There was not a consistency in religious practice in terms of coming together for prayer and other kinds of spiritual disciplines. So as a result of that, about 20 years later, she founded a new convent called St. Joseph's Convent for a stricter observance, kind of trying to return to the roots of the Carmelite rule. Let me say a little bit about, the 5 centuries or 3 centuries before them of Carmelite history. So the Carmelites are a fairly unique order in the history of the church. The founders of the Carmelite order were crusaders in the Holy Land who grew disillusioned with the fact that they were murdering people in the name of Christ. So this is around the late 12th century, early 13th century. They gathered on a place called Mount Carmel that was associated with the prophet Elijah, and they lived as hermits. Eventually, in around 1215, the Turks invaded and took control of the Holy Land. So all of these Carmelites would have been from Europe, right? They'd come over as crusaders. They're now living in the wilderness of Judea. And many of them fled back to their countries of origin, which is how the Carmelites got into Europe. Others stayed and were killed. When the Carmelites came into Europe, the church didn't know what to do with them. They were hermits that lived in individual cells, gathered together for prayer. They didn't want to be in a monastery. And so the church kind of put them under the mendicant movement that we talked about last week with Francis. So Carmelites kind of became another branch of the mendicant movement along with the Dominicans. So but they maintained in those early years a fairly strict observance to the notion of contemplation being the foundation of their ministry. And that distinguished them in some ways. They also dressed very strangely, given the fact that they had come from the East. And one of the stories I remember hearing during my formation is that when they would walk down the streets with these black and white striped cloaks, and long beards, looking like Eastern people, that the residents of the towns would pour their chamber pots out on top of their heads. I don't know if it's true or not, but the idea was they had a hard time fitting in. And there is a story that Thomas Aquinas was en route to the Council of Trent, one of the sessions of the Council of Trent, in which he was going to try to get the Carmelites disbanded, but he died on the way to that session of the council, so the Carmelites lived to fight another day. I don't remember the exact reason anymore. There was a lot of internecine warfare between religious orders in those days. At any rate, one of the things, and this was true even while I was a Carmelite, one of the things that has been a part of Carmelite history is a return to the roots, a return to the origins, a return to contemplative prayer and to service that comes out of contemplative prayer. And that's the tradition that Teresa and John of the Cross are very much associated with. So if you'll note here, the same year that Teresa founds this convent for stricter observance, or what she would have called a return to the original spirit of Carmel, John entered the Carmelite order. Now, of course, the men and the women were in separate residences, and he came to know Teresa. John was also disappointed in the lack of observance in the Carmelite friary in which he lived, and he talked with Teresa about joining the Carthusians, which was another religious order. She talked him out of it, and so he stayed within the Carmelites. About 4 years after this, Teresa was given permission by the Carmelite Prior General to start some reformed houses. So she had St. Joseph's, and then she was able to start some other houses. And these were both, some of them were for men and some of them were for women. And a year later, John joined one of Teresa's reformed houses. Now, from 1577 to 1580, there was tremendous conflict within the Carmelite order over the reforms that Teresa and John were trying to bring about. Teresa was ordered by the Superior General of the Carmelites at one point to close all of her houses and retire to one of them. And I believe she chose St. Joseph's. John was actually put in prison by other Carmelites and was subject to torture. He was actually whipped daily in front of the whole community and then confined in a very tiny cell. He managed to escape from that after about 9 months of confinement. But this whole period between 1577 and 1580 was a time of trial for the reform movement in the Carmelite order. Teresa was being denounced in Rome. The Reformed friars, as I said, were engaged in this, kind of fighting with one another. And finally, what brought an end to that, interestingly enough, was Philip II of Spain, who intervened in Rome, and the Pope at the time gave permission for the reform to continue. Both Teresa and John were very prolific authors, and we're going to talk about a couple of their works today. But because they wrote so much about the spiritual life, and because eventually what they wrote became quite accepted within Catholic theology and spirituality, both of them became doctors of the church. John in 1926, Not surprising that John became first because he's very systematic in the way he approaches things, so very easy to look at theologically, and probably because he was a man. And Teresa finally in 1970. And I already mentioned a bit about the relationship between Teresa and John. So that's, and I'll try to answer more questions about that history or biography stuff if you want later. But I really want to focus more on the spirituality. And one of Teresa's masterpieces of the spiritual life is a book titled The Interior Castle. And she uses the symbol of a castle in the round. And there's, I'm going to not get all 6 of them in here, but there's supposed to be 6. How many do I have here? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, not bad. Okay. 6. Does she call them rooms? Yeah. There's 6 rooms to the castle. So you start here and you're moving into the center. And this is how she talks about the development of the spiritual life. So out here, you're kind of not too attached to God. And as you move deeper and deeper within, you're letting go of attachments to the world. You're letting go of preconceived notions about God. You're letting go of preconceived notions about prayer. And you're opening yourself to more contemplative experience of God, which we defined as simply being in the presence of the God who is always present to us. And in the center of the castle is Christ, the bridegroom of the soul. So that what Teresa uses the image of a wedding, a spiritual wedding, as the way the soul becomes united with God. And specifically, she talks about Christ. And that's a dominant symbol for Teresa, this notion of the soul becoming one with Christ. In fact, it's a dominant image of all the mystics. Some of them just emphasize it a bit differently. Now, I'm not going to spend time talking about all the 6 levels because I think it's overdone. I don't think the spiritual life is that difficult that you have to pass through 6 different levels to get to the center of the castle. The idea is to keep in mind the broader notion that you're moving inward. You're moving from outside to the inside. You're moving from being further from God to being united with God. That's the primary significance of what the interior castle is all about. The other thing that Teresa uses throughout the castle, and I think it's particularly at stage 4, but it figures in at various places, is water as a symbol of the movement of the spiritual life. And of course, it makes sense. We think of water as movement. We think of water as being very important in life. And, you know, she grew up in a region where there would be rivers. And so this would be a very common image of movement, development, growth. She does make an interesting distinction, which I think is helpful for how to think about water and how to think about the spiritual life. And the distinction she made, and I referenced it briefly in the very first talk of the series, is a distinction between meditation and contemplation. So Teresa says meditation is like throwing a bucket into a well and then having to pull the water up. So you're doing a lot of work. You're reading the scriptures, you're thinking about it, you're wondering how it applies to you. It's work, it's effort. Contemplation, on the other hand, the water is just flowing in. You're not doing anything. You're just letting the water flow in. Okay? So I think it's a helpful image for us to think about the difference in kind of 2 phases of spiritual development. One where we're being much more active. We're having to work harder. Part of the reason we're working harder is because we're moving from outside of a closer union to God to inside. And so that takes work. It takes thinking. It takes looking at oneself and deciding what one has to give up along the way in order to become closer to God. But as you approach that closeness and as you get into these inner chambers, then the water is flowing freely because God's presence is experienced more completely, more regularly, more commonly. It's just there. God is just there. So I think her notion of the water that you don't have to work for, the water that's always, that's there, is also a good description of grace. It's also a good description of what I said earlier about the fact that contemplation is merely being present to the God who is already always present to us. It doesn't take a lot of work to do that. You just have to put yourself in that presence and be open to the flowing of that presence. Now, I put in, this is a very famous prayer that you may have heard of before that Teresa wrote. And I was going to put the Spanish version in, but I'll say something about the Spanish version. But let me read it, say something about it, and then say something about how I think it may apply to today. So Teresa writes, "Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing away." Another way of saying that is all things are temporary. God never changes. All things are temporary. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone suffices, or God alone is sufficient. In Spanish, many of you know the word for nothing is nada. So when I'm in a particularly distressed state, one of the ways I say this prayer is I just go nada, 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 nada. Nothing, okay? But God is what's important. Teresa is also echoing Paul in Romans chapter 8, where he says, "Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Neither height, nor depth, nor demons, nor angels, nor powers. Nothing can separate us from the love of God that comes to us in Christ." So it's a similar kind of idea. Again, I've mentioned that in church history we've tended to ignore the mystics, and yet here Teresa is really speaking to something that Paul wrote about centuries before. Now, when I first put this prayer in here, when I was putting this together during the summer and early part of the fall, I was thinking about how this prayer is really a prayer of consolation. The idea being that if one is focused on God, if one is practicing contemplative prayer, being in the presence of the God who is always present to us, many of the things that frighten and disturb us will tend to have less effect on us. It's not that they're gone, but they'll have less effect on us because we're focused on the one thing that is most important, which is the relationship with God. And through that relationship, everything else that's important will come to us. That is really what Teresa is saying there. Don't get distracted by the stuff going around out here or even out here, but stay centered here. Now, the reason I think this is, as I said, I don't know if this is fate or what, karma, but I mean, we're living in a time of great disturbance, in my personal opinion. Some of you may or may not agree with that. We're living in a time when lots of people are afraid of lots of things because of what's going on in Washington. We're getting attacks on law firms. We're getting inspectors general who oversee things being thrown out of office. We're getting disrespect for the judiciary when the president disagrees with them. Just recently, the Department of Agriculture announced that they're cutting back on food aid programs. And yesterday I read a story that, again, given my background, particularly disturbing. VA psychiatrists having to go into cubicles in federal office buildings and provide psychiatric help in insecure and non-confidential ways. where anybody can walk by and see what is being said. It's medically unethical, and some of them are going to resign. And the VA has already lost money, so it's just going to be more wait times. So what I'm saying is we're living in disturbing times. There's a lot of times when I have to say nada, 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 and I find it hard because although in the depth of my soul I feel the union with God that alone is sufficient, sometimes those turbulent waters get very close to the center. They're not just up here. The volume of stuff that is hitting us, the volume of stuff that can be frightening, can really make it difficult to stay in that center. I think Teresa is right that that's where we have to stay. We have to cling. We have to admit that Teresa never says we're not going to live through disturbing or frightening or troubling times, and she herself did. But she's offering a way of thinking about how to remain centered on God in the midst of that, and how that may then lead one to live a life that responds to those things taking place around one. So I think it's a good prayer, and I really like the short version, nada, 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 and the number of times I have to say it to myself. So the central insight from Teresa there, that arrow, the spiritual journey is always one toward an ever deeper union with God, who already is residing within us. God is in this inner circle in the castle. Okay? We may be out here, or we may be here. God is always there. And the journey is to get closer and closer to the experience of that union. Not an intellectual understanding of the union, not somebody, again, not to take offense with Thomas Aquinas, he did some great things, but not how you can theologize about all that, but to experience it. Okay, and we can come back to any questions you might have about Teresa later. Now let's talk about John of the Cross of Spirituality, where Teresa uses a castle. John uses the image of the ascent of Mount Carmel. And so go Mount Carmel. And there's different stages along this before you get to union with God up here. But it's the same idea, okay? I think it may be significant that John chose the image of a mountain because he emphasizes much more than Teresa how difficult this journey can be and how there will be experiences of darkness along the way. John, of course, is famous for having written about, and he has a whole book by this title, The Dark Night of the Soul. So what is John talking about when he's talking about darkness and the dark night of the soul and ascending Mount Carmel? What John is saying is that at every stage of the spiritual journey, you have to give up something that you thought was the right way of approaching it. You have to be open to a new way of understanding your relationship with God. And that's hard, because if something's working for us, we don't want to give it up. But God may be calling us to a deeper understanding, a new understanding. So these periods of transition can be experienced as darkness, really as a sense of God leaving us, because the way that God was present to us before no longer seems to be working for us. Prayer can feel dry. So we can have the intention of moving into a prayerful stance before God and being aware of the presence of the God who is always already present to us, and we might not experience him. We might not experience God. We might experience an emptiness, a dryness, an absence. So what John is trying to say there is right in that darkness, there's going to be light, but you don't see it now. Right in that dryness, there's going to be relief and joy. Right in that emptiness, there's going to be fullness. But you have to stay with the darkness. You have to stay with the dryness. You have to stay with the emptiness and believe that God is there. Believe, one of the ways John says it, is that God's very absence is a sign of his presence. It's kind of a upside down kind of way of thinking about it, but it makes sense. So, and again, keep in mind, John suffered for his beliefs, for his understanding about God. And so this notion of spiritual darkness and how it can lead to a new insight, a new sense of light and of direction is one that he experienced internally himself, which I think gives it its authenticity. And again, I won't say again what I said earlier, but you can see how this applies to us today, where many of us can feel like we're in darkness and not sure what the next step is going to be. And John's words to us are, stay in the darkness, wait until God reveals himself. It's interesting to me that John of the Cross's feast day is December the 12th, which always is in the middle of Advent, because John of the Cross is an Advent Christian. John of the Cross is a Christian who waits for God, who waits in the darkness, who doesn't let the darkness dissuade him from an awareness that God is present even in the darkness. And I think that, again, is a challenge for us today. I put a couple of thoughts down here from some of John's poetry, and you can see how he plays with these images of light and darkness. O night more kindly than the dawn. How is that even possible to think of? Night more kindly than the dawn. O you night that united lover with beloved, the beloved in the lover transformed. So John is using some of the same imagery that Teresa's using about the soul's union with God. He focuses more on God the Father than Teresa does. But the notion here is that the darkness is making you ready for a new kind of relationship with the light, a darkness that is transforming, a darkness that will lead you to a new way of being. And one of my favorite quotes from him, that again I think is very, very relevant to today. I went out without discerning, so he's going out into the night, with no light to guide me, but that which within my heart was burning. So John's relying on his own experience of God, his own sense that in the midst of this darkness there is a light, and if he can find that light no other place, he finds it in the darkness inside himself. Again, this strange kind of joining of images that we tend to find disparate. He finds a unity, that darkness is the place where light can be found, that darkness can usher in a new sense of reality, a new sense of union with God, with the bridegroom. So I think the central insight we take from John is that God's presence in the darkness is such that darkness itself becomes light. During Advent, Charles asked me to give a homily during one of the Wednesday liturgies. And I worked on this theme a bit then. I just want to share with you some of what I said at that time. In my practice as a clinical psychologist, I often found that people who came seeking help were in darkness. That's the essence of mental anguish, mental pain, a sense of darkness. And that for the people who got better, they were the ones who were willing to march straight through the darkness to get to the other side, to find the light on the other side. Because you have to go through the darkness, you have to go through the suffering, you have to go through the pain to come to a new way of looking at yourself in the world. And I often found that people who couldn't do that, who kind of stopped at a way station, they got a little bit of light, a little bit of nourishment, that was good enough. They never quite got to where they were looking for. Some of them came back and continued the journey. But I think there's a profound sense that we know that darkness cannot be escaped in any of our lives, whether it's the darkness of psychological pain, whether it's a darkness related to loss, to a chronic illness, to anything. The darkness has to be embraced as part of the human condition. And what John offers us is the hope, the belief in his own life experience that embracing that darkness will lead to light and to a new way of being. All right, so I'll stop there and take any questions that you might have about any of this. I realize this was a bit heavier than last week, so there may be a reluctance to ask questions.
Al is not reluctant.
Thank you, Al.
So my question for you is, how does one go about embracing the darkness? Is there a process for doing that, or is it just enough to simply say, oh, today's dark, tomorrow will be a better day?
I think the first half of the statement is right. Today is dark.
Yeah.
I don't think you necessarily have to move to tomorrow will be a better day, because tomorrow may be dark too, especially in the times we're living in. So what is the process of embracing the darkness? Well, it starts by accepting that there is darkness. You can't embrace darkness until you accept it. And then moving from accepting to embracing is the belief that the darkness holds something, that darkness isn't the last word, that something is in the darkness that will be revealed. That's the embracing. Does that help?
Yeah, so it's complicated.
Yeah, well, it's not easy. It's not easy emotionally to do this. This is why the simpler form is nada, 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 right? Because to sit in the darkness is painful. But most of you have experienced some kind of darkness in your lives, I'm guessing, whether it's the death of a loved one or another type of loss. And if you don't let that experience, if you don't let yourself be present to that experience, you don't get to the other side of it. You don't see okay, too many thoughts are coming at one time. So let me back up a bit. When I was still a priest, my great-grandmother died. And I was reading a book by Anne Morrow Lindbergh, which the title of which I'm going to forget right now, but it's a meditation on the death of her husband. And one of the things she says in that is that when a person dies, it's like a tree falling in the forest. For the first time, you can see the entirety of the tree. Think of a tall tree going up, you can't see it. Falls, you can finally see the entirety. Well, I think that's another apt image for when we have a loss, there's something new that's going to be revealed. But we have to stay with the loss. We have to stay with the emotional experience of the loss to see the whole tree, to see what's going to be revealed. So, I keep wanting to go back to your question because I don't want to say that this is facile or easy or simple. It's hard. And I think John is a guide through that by telling us to trust that God is in the darkness, even if we don't experience him in the darkness. To trust that the darkness itself, that this absence is actually presence. It won't feel that way. Eventually, something will move. Does that help? More?
Think about the other question you raised, which is the idea that absence somehow proves presence.
Well, so Hal is saying that brings up the other question, that absence is really presence. Well, some of you, I'm sure, have experienced the death of a loved one. And there is a great experience of absence. But I am imagining that many of you who have experienced that have also continued to experience the presence of that loved one in some way. Okay? Absence can be a sign of presence. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Absence makes us aware of presence. And in that sense, absence is presence. But it's a challenge to our religious imagination, our spiritual imagination, to kind of turn these symbols upside down. But, I mean, Christianity is founded on a symbol turned upside down, that out of death comes new life. So, I think all of this is pointing toward the central message of Christianity, which is itself a mystery and is itself a difficulty, a difficult spiritual process. Somebody else, Elaine, Charles, do you have the...
I was just going to say, I think our bodies have this, because when we go into a dark room, we always say, wait, your eyes will adjust. Mm-hmm. And then you'll be able to see some light. You'll be able to see some more. Mm-hmm. So I think we have this in our normal human existence. We just don't always recognize it.
I think that's an excellent point, and I feel embarrassed that I didn't think about it myself. But it's true that, and what I like about that is it takes a while, right? And that's what I think John is talking about, that if you can embrace that darkness, instead of turning on the light right away, if you can stay in the darkness, things will start to reveal themselves that are different, that you weren't expecting, perhaps. I think Richard had a question.
Pardon me if you covered this in previous lectures, I was not here, but you mentioned the Reformation, or the reforms that both John and Teresa embraced. What were those reforms, and were they related to the Protestant Reformation or the Protestant Revolt?
Right. No, the reforms that John and Teresa were supporting didn't have anything to do with the Reformation. It was an attempt to return to the original idea behind Carmelite religious life. So it was a reform back to the original roots of Carmelite life and an emphasis on contemplative prayer. That's why they wrote so much about contemplative prayer, about union with God, using one set of symbols or another. That's the reform they're talking about, okay? Anyone else?
Ian.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for this. Your talk about John of the Cross reminded me of some themes in society these days that, you know, both the society struggle with as broadly as well as individuals, say, who are struggling with depression, et cetera. And, you know, some of the themes that kind of came through when you're talking about John and kind of the way that you get through hard times into the easy, or to like more wholeness, or whatever you would call it. You know, some of the thoughts that came to mind for me were thinking versus experiencing, right? and sometimes our ego's desire to think through things rationally versus just accepting and experiencing and being with whatever you're going through. The struggle that some people have with overthinking, which makes me wonder if it's like overthinking is something like avoiding hard truths, you know. And then other ideas that just came to mind included the hard thing that you're avoiding is often exactly what you need to be doing, right? Also, it seems a lot of that avoiding is something like overcoming the need to overcome your ego, right? You know, I've got all this figured out. I must be able to think it through instead of having to accept it. Also, there's a lot of power in waiting things out, comes to mind. And then I thought I saw something on the internet recently. It was just a video of the famous comedic actor Jim Carrey, who struggled greatly with depression, right? And I don't remember all of the details of his video, but he was up in front of a large crowd, and he just said, you know, we think of the word depressed, and you know, at one point he was struggling through that and got to the other side of it and realized that what he needed was deep rest, like deep rest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This like idea that you have to be in that
Mm-hmm.
and be willing to stay in it for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if wrestle with it is what it is.
I'm sorry, what you
I
said?
don't know if it's like wrestling with it, it's
Mhm.
or just resting in it.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mhm.
he made that kind of interesting parallel between the word depressed and the idea of being in deep rest is
Mhm.
what you need.
Mhm. Well, there's so many things you said there. I'm not going to try to comment on them all, but I agree with them. I'm going to comment on just one of them, which is the notion of overthinking or thinking. That contemplative prayer, as I kind of indicated in the very first of the talks in this series, is a kind of an antidote to overthinking and over-theologizing. Because contemplative prayer is not thinking about God. It's not trying to explain the Trinity. Contemplative prayer is an experience of God. It's moving to the experiential level. And one of the things that makes it hard for Westerners is that we've been taught to use our minds for everything. And so if we're not able to think our way through things, it becomes difficult for us. And so I think you're right, that part of this transition to a different way of looking at the world is a way of letting the world be what it is, not trying to figure it out, not trying to think our way out of it, but simply be present to it and see what it reveals. Anyone else?
Maybe just, I can't remember this over our lunches at Jimmy, but the answer to this question, a short autobiographical sketch of how you became a Carmelite rather than a Jesuit or a Trappist or, you know.
Well, it's really simple in some ways. So I grew up in Southern California, and the parish that I went to, there was a Carmelite high school in the San Fernando Valley, not far from where we lived. And the parish that I lived in, one of the Carmelites came to that parish to say Mass every Sunday. And so my parents were he was really a good preacher. And my parents made the decision, you're going to go to that high school. Little did they know what would come later. But it's so, you know, was God's hand in that? Who knows? I don't know. I mean, I was grateful for the years I was in the Carmelites. But I think it's the way a lot of vocations to religious life happen. It's just a question of proximity to a particular group of individuals who somehow capture your imagination, and you know, it's not like you do a study of all the different religious orders, and that's how you go. That's where you go. So that's how it happened. Okay,
Thank
Anyone
you,
else?
Ron, so much.
All right, thanks, everybody. Next week, we're going to move into some lesser-known people, beginning with, and now I'm going to block on her name, Juliana of Norwich, an English anchoress. You may not have ever heard of that term, but it's another term for hermit in the 14th century during the Black Death. So very interesting woman. Thank you all very much.